Okay. Now I will be talking about apps and mobile games in 2023. I mean, at least I hope some useful data. I hope for you. So I will be looking at kind of few points, like the revenue in mobile gaming and apps, download trends, opportunities for apps and games, like some growth opportunities. So I will try to touch those topics. So if we start from the first one, it's like if you start to talk to the people in mobile gaming, very often it's not the most optimistic scenario and the most optimistic picture. Once you start to the people in the last months, because most of the companies struggle to keep the revenue, keep the growth. There is more and more actually focus on the profit, not just on the revenue on the market. So not always the mood is the best, and of course it's kind of reflecting reality as well. This is actually the data that was released by Newzoo just a few days ago. In their November update, where actually they kind of updated the forecast they had around the mobile gaming market for this year between their pre-pandemic forecast. So that forecast they had the pre-pandemic for the year 2022, and then they updated the data. So we see that when they analyzed that data for 2020, and then they did this assumption and analysis before the pandemic, of course the final outcome was much higher than they expected. And the same for the next year. But then if we look at the 2022, in some way that 2022 is even lower than 2021. And I think, of course, always there is this challenge around, it's great when something is growing and so on. But I think it's really important to look at that from broader perspective. That I think is, if we look at deeper analysis from Newzoo, that's actually the estimations for the current year, when we see that negative growth rate this year for mobile games and for browser PC and for console games, very small growth for the PC games. But again, I think it's really important to look at that from the broader perspective, because if we go look at that a little bit broader, so that's the year-over-year data, year versus year, over the last 3 years, more or less. So each month we see year-over-year versus the previous year. So in this case, we said, for example, have January 2022 versus January 2021. And if we look at that, it's very very easy to get pessimistic once you look just at that picture, because again, in the last months, this year-over-year growth is negative, but we just forget about this one. It's like we had actually quite long time, like almost 2 years, when the industry was growing like 20, 25, almost 30% year-over-year. It's almost impossible to have in the very long term industry growing in such way, especially that, again, if we look at the year-over-year growth rate, we are actually counting that towards this really big base as well. So again, even if we see that, for example, let's see the current year-over-year is, for example, around -7%, -8%, it's still, that level is much higher than versus pre-pandemic. It's very easy to forget about that. The second point that is actually good to look at that is, if we look at the details, we start to see that actually, because in this year-over-year part, we are going from this biggest base as well. So that's actually, that metrics start to look more and more positive as well. And then, if we go even deeper, kind of similar situations it's in the mobile apps as well. In this case, in the mobile apps, this growth is a little bit higher, so still it's kind of positive, which of course is coming from the point that you know in mobile apps we have much more you know, new revenue stream coming, for example, from subscriptions. That is still in some way taking some part in the mobile gaming, but is adopting at much lower pace. But still, of course, if we look at this extremely high base, again, it's very hard to forget. It's very easy to forget about that base. Yeah, so it's like, again, it's still, I think, mobile gaming and apps is a really good place to be. And then we actually tend to forget about an additional quite important thing. It's actually really easy to forget that, for example, like, you know, mobile gaming is competing with other types of entertainment as well, yeah? And if we look, for example, at such simple data as, for example, okay, what are like the live event ticket booking? And if we compare, okay, what happened in 2020 and 2021, of course, part of that growth was coming from that as well, yeah? Because if someone didn't go to the cinema or didn't go to the theater, he had more money to spend, for example, on games as well. And that's why, even if we go further, you know, how much even that revenue, that industry actually lost in the revenue, for example, like, you know, see, like, if we look at the music, sports, comedy, theater, yeah, so let's compare 2020 versus 2019, for example, yeah, it's like, you know, it's like 20, like 30% of something that was in the previous year. So, and because right now it's expected that like, you know, industry to get back to that specific pace, of course, it has some not necessarily the best outcome for the mobile gaming. And then if we go further and we start even to compare, okay, even if we compare that, for example, okay, that was the hardest timing, for example, for these live events, and then what was the best period, for example, for like on the gaming, YouTube gaming live? That was. It's in this case, that was exactly the timing. Yeah. So again, of course, always the time and the money that the user have, it's kind of parts of the competition between different groups of the users. And then if we even go further and ask ourselves, okay, for example, like how much, for example, this average annual expenditure of the, you know, plays, theater, or opera, for example, fall down in like US. And actually, if we go even to the data and we start to look that, for example, that decline was even much higher, for example, in US, in Australia, than in other markets, because, for example, like on the global level, that ticket booking declined by 77%, but for example in US it declined by 90%. That's why that if we look at, for example, at the US data and start to compare it, for example, like, you know, global data on the revenue for the mobile gaming versus US data on the mobile gaming, we see much higher like base coming. Much higher base coming in US in this year of pandemic, and then that decline is a little bit lower, higher now in US versus the pre-pandemic. Yeah, so that's why, for example, like if we look even at the revenue in the mobile gaming, I would say those that were very relying, for example, on Wales. Those that were very relying just on like US and tier markets right now are suffering a little bit more than those ones that actually this pandemic time was a little bit harder for them because that you know, that market was smaller in like emerging markets, but now that decline is actually harder in US. And actually, it's the same case both in mobile gaming as in case of the apps as well, yeah? So actually, that's why I think it's very hard, very important, actually, especially nowadays, to I would say not focus just not only tier 1 markets, but really think about those next wave of the markets, because again, that other types of entertainment, they're actually much bigger competition, much bigger danger in those tier 1 like US markets and other markets, yeah. And then even if we go further and we ask ourselves, okay, but what it means really to download trends, yeah? And if we start to look from the higher level, we see that, for example, like, okay, we had that time, for example, on the global level, when the revenue was growing much faster than the downloads, which of course put a lot of pressure on the CPI because of the install. But now, of course, we have challenges on the revenue side, but the downloads are growing better. So which means that there is at least still less pressure on the CPI, as long as we know how to use it. Yeah. And I will talk about that later. And if we look at the mobile apps, is kind of similar, which means that I think it's even actually showing that, for example, like such picture should even give us more, for example, ideas and more motivation to think about, for example, hybrid monetization, yeah? How to really extend monetization, not just to those types when actually we are really relying on whales, on just revenue, but actually how, for example, utilize of those, still higher level of downloads than the revenue, which of course mostly is coming that those downloads are actually usually in emerging markets. But not necessarily, because if we go further in the data, even in US, for example, in the recent months, we see that actually that level of growth is actually for downloads is actually a bit higher than for revenue, which means that again I think it should be a really important point into thinking. Okay, for example, how to extend ratio of users who are monetizing the game. Yeah, how to not just rely that. Squeeze more out of whales, but how to actually think how to use those users that might maybe not necessarily paying, but can give actually the value to the games in different way, like by watching ads, maybe doing maybe some sharing with some friends, or like adding some additional value, because actually even the data shows that there is probably more and more users that can be really used or like monetized, not necessarily by the revenue. And then if we look at the mobile apps, it's kind of similar, but in this case that revenue is a little bit on a safer side, so it's actually happening by itself already. And that's, I think, it's even like deeper thinking around, for example, ad monetization. Yeah, because if we look at the projections for the mobile gaming ad revenue, for example, in US, those projections are bigger than, for example, for the revenue. Yeah, so if we, for example, we saw that, for example, in-app revenue has the growth rate in US around like -5, -7% year over year. At the same time, the mobile ad revenue, it has the positive growth rate. And then if we even add to that point that, for example, in US, that is like in this case the biggest market, so much actually digital ad spending is actually on mobile, that we see the reason for that, especially that I think like the mobile ad revenue is a little bit on the safer side than revenue than IIP revenue, because there are more drivers that actually pushing that the growth. For example, like if we know that in US retail is so much important part of the whole ad industry, like it's like 26%, like more than 25% of the whole market is retail, and that spending is growing 24% year over year, and most of that is mobile, then it's not strange that that market is growing at pretty nice rate, and it's really quite important to use it. And in this case, I think it's actually not just about US, because I gave it as the example, but it's very, for example, recent data about Latin America. Yeah, I think many developers just recently are really discovering Latin America as the very, very important market for gaming, and Latin America as well. If you compare it, okay, how actually are estimations for mobile ad spending in those markets, and how actually even this mobile part will be getting important more and more in bigger part of the whole revenue, and how in general the ad spending is growing very heavily. Yes, and then that mobile part is very important part of that spending. So that's why, in general, of course, this mobile gaming part will be quite growing there as well. So I think it's good to really look at that. I think there is more and more really interesting data around how actually that part of the revenue is growing. I really encourage you, for example, to download this Unity report if you haven't, because it has pretty nice data around, based on data, for example, in which genres this ARPDAU in advertising is growing, where it's declining. So I think it's really makes sense to look at that. And then, of course, we can ask ourselves, okay, but what are like the opportunities for the apps and games? So if we start from the apps, that's the data based on the data AI. And I look at the year-over-year data, both for the downloads and both for the revenue. Yeah? So to try to understand, okay, which of those genres are growing faster, which of those genres are growing at lower pace. So we see there are some genres that are growing really strongly, like shopping. And again, in general, I think retail is getting the black horse of the growth in general in almost every market. So that's why those tools are really growing heavily. Finance as well. Again, I think over the COVID, a lot of people started to use digital for those, finance applications. And then, of course, there is a lot of instability on the market, which in general is growing motivation for using Forex or like some broker platforms and so on. And then of course, social entertainment, because again we just got to know about that. Education. It's actually right now on small decline. I think it's coming from the fact that, again, it was growing extremely crazy over the COVID. And because all the lessons, all like the learning platform, like in general, the offline experience was not possible. Right now it is. So in general, some learning platforms have some challenges. If we look at the games, that's the look at the mobile games. So we see very strong growth for the strategy games on the download side, which actually is coming from the fact that just recently some strategy games discovered some markets like Pakistan, some really tier 3 countries, trying sometimes even to add some ad monetization there as well. But we have pretty nice growth for let's see, card games, music games, and actually we have the hardest part, those whale-driven games, types of the games. Again, RPG, action games, in general, those that in general are mostly focusing on IIP. And on US, for example, they actually have the hardest time in the recent months. If you look at the iOS, it's kind of similar, maybe with the difference that usually the growth rate's a little bit lower on iOS side. So I would say most of those genres, if we look at the year over year, they are actually on the revenue and downloads decline, at least year over year. But again, we are talking about year over year versus really big base. We need to remember about that. And still, again, the hardest part is really around those, IIP-driven games. Especially that I think in this case, I try to remove the China to have a little bit better picture on what's happening on the market. If we look at the country opportunities, we can actually divide those countries into a few parts. Those are like the countries that have the highest growth rate in terms of revenue and downloads. So we have countries like Indonesia, actually even Poland is on that positive side. Brazil, India, Hong Kong, Arabic countries. So those are like those growing markets in terms of year over year. If we look at the other side, those that have the hardest and the lowest growth rate, that's actually quite interesting data around day 30. So we see that exactly there are some categories, both on apps and games, that actually have challenges in terms of retention rate. Yeah? So exactly, for example, shopping, again, we saw that it's growing, but growth is usually bringing the competition as well. So there is more and more actually shopping apps, and everyone is trying to push it to the user. So again, that is not easy to retain the user as well. The same with the finance. So again, we saw it that exactly those categories that have the highest growth, they usually brought the highest number of competition as well. That actually is really pushing the competition heavily. Again, that was in case of shopping, in case of finance, as you remember. And we have actually the same situation in gaming as well, that in general those retention rates are declining a bit. On the other side, if we look from the positive side, we see that those ones that are doing the good work still are actually on the good side. Because, for example, if I look at the top 100 games by revenue in US, and I compare the average time per active user, actually, we saw that if we compare the data before the pandemic and after the pandemic, still, that actually engagement on those games is actually higher. So on one side, yes? Average time per it's indexed. So it's like this is the base. So like in this case, again, if you compare it, so it over like 2 years it increased by like 20% more or less, yeah. Sometimes I cannot use the direct numbers because of the license and all that stuff related, of course, to the data. Yeah. But still, we see that actually that engagement grew. Yeah. So we are hearing that okay, the retention rates are going down. There's competition, but still, those ones that are doing that well are able to keep the user higher. So I think again, there is still pretty good opportunity on this side as well. And then still the forecast for the gaming is quite nice. So again, it's still a good place to be. Even if Newzoo just recently updated that projection for this year, like decreased a little bit by just like small percentage from like 184 to around 180. billion, still the projections for the next years are really good. Yeah, so again, that's kind of decline is coming from the big base. And then if we look especially on the user side, it's still a pretty good place to be, especially on the mobile side, yeah, because if we look at the projections for the mobile, of course it's really competitive place, it's a really hard place, but if we look, for example, for those columns are showing what is share of the non-mobile players over the years and non-mobile payers. So again, if we think about mobile gaming company, that will be less and less such users who are not touching mobile at all. So again, if we look at this growth of the users, it's pretty nice graph. But actually, you know, again, still mobile will be growing really nice. And what is important actually, the potential growth for the revenue, for example, in the console and PC games, is projected to be higher than growth of the users, which means that the pressure on monetization will be quite high there. And it was quite interesting for me to actually to be on the conferences like this year. And actually, when I talked to many companies, what I kind of was interesting and surprising for me, actually, I heard a lot of information about like growing competition and so on. But actually, most of the time, I heard it much more often from non-mobile companies than from mobile companies. Because mobile companies got used to that competition. They got used to that, okay, it's very, very competitive market, and those that are not doing games for mobile just recently are facing this growing pressure for on competition in non-mobile games, yeah? And then if we look at the, so the total number of players and payers is growing up, but majority of those growth actually will be coming from mobile payers and mobile players. It's really good to remember about that. Because I think from time to time you can hear, okay, I will do them, like I'm doing the mobile games, but I will do the non-mobile because it's so much easier and there's lower competition. I don't think it's going to be the case for the next years. And then if we go even further, and we ask ourselves, okay, what is the share of non-mobile players? What is share of the non-mobile players? We see actually the very, very similar trend. So that competition, this non-mobile market actually will be growing very heavily because again, most of the growth on the mobile on the growth in the gaming market will be actually coming from mobile, if we like it or not. Okay. So just those were some points from my side. Just to summarize, please remember that COVID created a significant base. I know that this kind of seems very obvious, but I think if you look at the data then it's getting really obvious. Yeah. I mean, if we had some months when there was like, growth of the business, like, 40% year over year, or like sometimes even more, then it's hard to expect that like all over that it will be growing in that pace. Again, from what I saw, from what I see from the data, and from what I see even from discussions from different developers, it seems that those ones that were more focusing on tier 1 markets are more affected by those declines. And again, still many metrics are much higher base than actually they were before the COVID. Yeah, they are not on the COVID base because again, a lot of entertainment types that were not available during COVID are available now, but still. Those metrics in terms of engagement, monetization are at a very high level and make use of the new opportunities. Yeah, I mean sometimes my presentations are getting boring in terms of, okay, those data around those new countries, those data around like, you know, how the different genres are behaving. But it's very important to actually make use of the data, yeah, because I think when I started to work with mobile gaming, usually one of the first sentences discussing with like some developer was, okay, it's about US and nothing else. Yeah, it's like just that's really the most important part of the business. Do US and then just forget about the rest. But I don't think it's the case anymore. Like there's like, if you look at those countries, like, you know, even countries that were like, you know, tier 3 countries, they're actually getting quite important. Yeah, so like even like, you know, countries like, you know, Bangladesh, India, Vietnam, or even like Nigeria, all those markets actually can be really interesting ones, especially if you know how to approach the monetization of those markets. And that would be all from my side. I hope it was useful. Of course, feel free to add questions as well. Oh, okay. It seems that we don't have questions because those are like from the previous presentation. But if anyone has the presentation question like offline, feel free to ask as well. Any questions? Okay, if not, thank you for your time. So thank you everyone who was online. And for everyone who is here offline, like, you know, let's start some networking. Let's use that time to really, you know, mingle, discuss, and exchange some knowledge. Thank you very much.